You know, it's funny how some names from history really stick with you.
Yeah.
Like J.P. Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
You say that name, it's like instant Wall Street, you know?
Right. Big business, the Gilded Age.
Exactly. Fortunes, empires, the whole deal. But here's the thing. How much do we really know about the man himself?
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, he's this icon, this almost mythical figure in American finance.
Totally.
Easy to forget he was a real person, with his own quirks, contradictions.
Absolutely. Which is why we're diving into some Wikipedia excerpts today.
Always a good place to start.
Right. So let's get into it. John Pierpont Morgan, born 1837, Hartford, Connecticut, already sounds like the start of a Wall Street fairy tale.
Well, it wasn't exactly a rags to riches story, born into wealth. His dad, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a big-time banker himself. So young Pierpont, or that's what he preferred to be called.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he was basically groomed from the start for this world. High finance was in his blood.
But even with a silver spoon, you don't reach that level of power without some, challenges along the way.
Right. And one thing that I found really interesting was his childhood bout of rheumatic fever.
I almost forgot about that.
Yeah, it seems it really impacted his health, and he was always self-conscious about his appearance afterward.
He hated having his picture taken, right?
Hated it. Insisted on all his portraits being retouched.
Which, can we just talk about the irony there for a second?
He is.
This is a man who controlled the image of American finance, yet he was deeply insecure about his own image. That's fascinating to me.
Absolutely. I mean, it speaks to this awareness, maybe even a manipulation of how perception works, especially in his world.
Totally.
But to really understand his path, we have to look at his education. New England prep schools, then shipped off to Europe for even more schooling.
His dad was making sure he had every advantage.
Every advantage, preparing him for, really, a life of global finance.
And this is all happening as America itself is going through some major growing pains.
Oh, absolutely.
The country erupts in civil war, right as Morgan is coming of age in the business world. Talk about timing.
And it's during this tumultuous time, all the chaos and uncertainty of war, that we see those early glimpses of, well, the ambition, the ruthlessness that would define his career.
So what are we talking about? Give us an example.
Gold speculation, big business during the war.
Of course.
And then there's the, shall we say, infamous Hull Carbine affair.
Hull Carbine affair. It sounds almost polite.
Deceptively so. It was a scandal. The Union Army, desperate for weapons, gets sold these outdated rifles at hugely inflated prices.
And Morgan?
Morgan's involved. Profiting handsomely, we might add.
Wow.
Now, to be fair, historians still debate how much he knew about the finer points of the scheme, but
That's not a good look.
not at all. Highlights those murky ethical waters of the time and the lengths some people would go to for wealth.
Okay, so we've got a young J.P. Morgan, ambitious, clearly a knack for deal-making, even if those deals aren't always, by a book.
Right.
But how does he go from shrewd wartime operator to, like, the architect of American industry? That's the part I find really interesting.
Yeah, that's where things get interesting. Well, the post-Civil War era, that's where you see Morgan's, strategic genius come alive. He wasn't just playing the market.
Yeah.
He was reshaping it.
And the railroads, that was his first big stage.
Exactly. The railroad industry back then, it was a
Oh,
mess.
yeah.
Dozens of companies, all these competing lines, overlapping routes, inefficient. It was chaos.
Chaos that he saw as an opportunity.
Exactly. He saw the bigger picture when everyone else just saw, a bunch of trains.
So he starts buying up these railroads.
Not just buying, consolidating.
Yeah.
He'd acquire struggling lines, force mergers, cut costs like crazy, streamline everything.
Ruthless efficiency.
That was the Morgan way. And it wasn't just about profit, though. I mean, he definitely wasn't opposed to profit.
Right.
But he wanted to create these large, stable, manageable entities. That's how Morganization was born.
Morganization. It sounds so, I don't know, almost ominous, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't always pretty. Competitors forced out, workers dealing with harsh conditions, all in the name of efficiency, of progress.
The ends justify the means.
Pretty much. But there's no denying the impact. By the turn of the century, you have a handful of these Morgan-backed railroads controlling huge chunks of the country.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it.
Yeah.
This is the infrastructure that connected America,
Yeah.
that fueled the entire Second Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. And his influence, it didn't stop at railroads. Morgan, he understood that modern industry, it needed capital, and lots of it.
And he was the man to provide it.
J.P. Morgan and Co. They became the gateway financing the rise of, well, think General Electric, U.S. Steel, AT&T. We're talking titans of industry.
He wasn't just picking winners. He was basically choosing what companies would define American capitalism.
He had that kind of power. And it gets even wilder when you think about the Panic of 1893. The U.S. Treasury, it was on the verge of collapse.
Really? I don't remember learning about that.
Yeah, gold reserves, they were dwindling. The whole system was about to go bust.
Wait, so the entire country is about to go bankrupt, and J.P. Morgan just, what, steps in?
Pretty much. Gathers a bunch of financiers, presents a plan to President Grover Cleveland himself, ends up loaning the government millions in gold.
He bailed out the United States.
He bailed out the United States.
I don't even know what to say to that. Did anyone even question it back then? Like, one private citizen having that much influence?
Oh, there were critics, for sure. They saw it as, too much power in one man's hands.
Which, I mean, it's hard to argue with that.
Right. But no one can deny that he avoided complete economic meltdown.
It's like a double-edged sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stabilizes the system, but also raises all these questions about accountability, about the line between public interest and private gain. It seems like that tension really defines J.P. Morgan's story.
It's the paradox at the heart of his legacy. But he wasn't just this, ruthless consolidator. He had some surprisingly diverse interests.
Oh.
Technology, for one. Cutting-edge stuff.
Morgan. Really?
Yeah.
I wouldn't have pegged him for a tech guy.
Well, get this. He was an early backer of Nikola Tesla.
No way.
Poured money into Tesla's Wardenclyffe project. That ambitious attempt to build a global wireless communication system.
Hold on. Are you saying that J.P. Morgan almost accidentally invented Wi-Fi 100 years early?
Almost. It was Tesla's vision, but Morgan was bankrolling it until he got cold feet.
That happened.
Tesla wanted to expand it, include wireless power transmission. It was too much, even for Morgan. He pulled the plug.
Wow. That's one for the history books. But I guess it shows that even someone as powerful as Morgan couldn't predict the future or control everything, right?
Definitely not. And speaking of things he couldn't control, this was also the era of trust-busting, Teddy Roosevelt, the whole deal.
Right. Teddy Roosevelt going after monopolies. Where did Morgan fit into all of that? It's like you can't talk about big business in the early 1900s without thinking about Teddy Roosevelt, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
The trustbuster in chief. So where did J.P. Morgan stand when it came to, reining in corporate power?
Well, let's just say he wasn't exactly thrilled about it.
Right, because wouldn't that kind of go against everything he'd been working toward?
Exactly. And the Northern Securities case, that's the perfect example. Morgan, he'd put together this massive railroad holding company.
Basically a monopoly on rail lines in the Northwest.
Basically. Controlled everything. And Roosevelt, he saw this as like a direct challenge.
Yeah, and Roosevelt loved a good fight. He wasn't afraid to take on anyone.
No, he wasn't. And it turned into this huge legal battle, went all the way to the Supreme Court.
High stakes.
Yeah.
So what happened? Who won?
5-4 decision.
Yeah.
Roosevelt. The court ordered Northern Securities to be broken up.
Wow.
Yeah. It was a big blow to Morgan, at least to his reputation. And it really marked a turning point, in this whole battle between corporations and the government.
Between big business and, well, bigger government, I guess. But even after that, Morgan's influence didn't just disappear overnight.
No, not at all. In fact, just a few years later, he was right back in the thick of it. The Panic of 1907.
The Panic of 1907.
That was a total meltdown. Banks failing left and right, runs on gold, panic in the streets.
And no Federal Reserve yet to step in and save the day.
Nope. This was a different era. And who do you think steps up to handle it?
Let me guess. J.P. Morgan.
The one and only. Summons all these financiers to his house, not even his office, his library.
His library.
Locks them all in, basically, says, you don't leave until we figure this out.
I can only imagine the scene. Cigar smoke, shouting, deals being made on a handshake.
Something like that. But the point is, Morgan understood the stakes. He organized bailouts, brokered a deal between U.S. Steel and Tennessee Coal and Iron, all to prevent total financial collapse.
And it worked.
It worked. The panic subsided, markets stabilized. J.P. Morgan had done it again.
Saved the day. So was he a hero?
Yeah.
A villain? It's got to be more complicated than that, right?
Way more complicated. Did he save the system, or did his whole way of doing business create the problem in the first place? Those are questions historians are still debating.
It's like this never-ending debate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wall Street versus Main Street, the power of big money. It's also still so relevant today. But before we go too far down that road, I want to touch on something we talked about earlier. We spent a lot of time on Morgan's business dealings, his money, his influence. But what about the man himself? Like,
Yeah.
what else did he leave behind?
Right. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a huge art collector, loved books, had this incredible collection of rare books and manuscripts.
Oh, right, the Morgan Library.
Exactly. Donated generously to hospitals, museums, all sorts of things. That side of him, it kind of gets lost sometimes.
It's easy to forget that these titans of industry, these larger-than-life figures, they had other interests, other passions. It humanizes them a bit.
For sure. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. J.P. Morgan, he was a man of contradictions, a product of his time, but also someone who shaped that time in profound ways.
It reminds me of something you said earlier about how he was insecure about his own image, yet he controlled the image of American finance. It's like this strange duality that ran through his entire life.
Absolutely. And it's that duality, that complexity that makes him such an endlessly fascinating figure.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us for this deep dive into the life and legacy of John Pierpont Morgan. It's a story that really captures the spirit of an era with all his triumphs and his challenges. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
Thank you for listening. If you love history, don't forget to subscribe to History with Bree and Peter. Join us for more fascinating stories from the past. Hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode.